woman scrubbing Jaylen Cross's baseboard had fired 300 people in the last 6 months. Industrial cleaner with safety warnings in 3 languages. A warm towel she'd brought that he'd never seen. His furniture shifted exactly 3 inches from where he'd left it. She didn't flinch when he walked in, just looked up from the grape juice stain and told him he wasn't supposed to be back yet. But what came next destroyed everything Jaylen thought he knew about the last 6 years. His reassignments across Pennsylvania, Maryland, Louisiana, and Texas weren't about loyalty or promotion. They were strategic positioning, each one aligned with OSHA complaints filed weeks before, designed to make him absorb failure he'd never caused when facilities collapsed. The federal investigation? Already 8 months active. His name circled 17 times in subpoenas he'd never seen. Drop a comment where you're watching from and subscribe before someone you trust becomes the person positioning you to fail. Because Jaylen Cross is about to discover how many workers were used as insulation for institutional collapse, and why the truth he's about to speak will make him more dangerous than 6 years of silence ever did. The woman scrubbing Jaylen Cross's baseboard had fired 300 people in the last 6 months, but she wouldn't tell him why she was in his apartment until the towel dried. Jaylen had noticed the shifts before he saw her. The couch sat 3 inches farther from the wall than it had that morning, angled just enough that the afternoon light no longer caught the armrest the way Malik liked when he did homework. The coffee table had migrated toward the window, close enough now that someone sitting on the couch would have to reach awkwardly for a drink. Small violations, each one precise enough to feel intentional. The kind of thing a burglar wouldn't bother with because it served no purpose except to prove presence. The towel hanging over the kitchen chair was still damp when he touched it, not wet, not dripping, but warm in a way that meant someone had used it within the last 10 minutes. The apartment smelled wrong too, sharp with industrial cleaner, the kind that came in gallon jugs with safety warnings printed in 3 languages. It didn't belong in a place where the strongest chemical was usually dish soap. She was kneeling near the hallway when he finally saw her, one hand working a brush in slow circles over a grape juice stain that had been there since March. Malik had spilled it during a homework meltdown, and Jaylen had scrubbed at it twice before giving up and deciding it didn't matter. The woman didn't flinch when Jaylen froze in the doorway. She looked up, measured him once with eyes that had already made their assessment, and set the brush down like his arrival had been built into her schedule. "You weren't supposed to be back yet," she said. Not an apology, not an excuse, just a fact, delivered in the same tone someone might use to mention the weather. Jaylen's keys were still in his hand, his work boots still laced, and this stranger was discussing his timing like she'd been consulting his calendar. "Who let you in?" Jaylen asked. She wiped her hands on a towel that hadn't come from his kitchen, one she must have brought with her along with the cleaner and the brush and whatever else she'd decided she needed. "Your landlord," she said. "I told him there was a water issue in the unit below. He didn't ask for paperwork." That should have scared Jaylen more than it did. What unsettled him wasn't that she'd lied her way inside, but that she said it so calmly, like access was something she negotiated often enough to know which excuses worked and which didn't. She gestured toward the kitchen counter, and that was when Jaylen saw the folder. It sat between Malik's math worksheet and a folded utility bill, thin and official-looking, the kind with a cardstock cover that government offices used when they wanted something to feel serious. Jaylen hadn't put it there. It hadn't been there when he left for his shift at 6 that morning, and Malik wouldn't be home from his aunt's place in Fairfax County until after 7. "I'm not here to threaten you," the woman said, standing slowly and drying her hands again even though they looked dry already. "And I'm not here to apologize. Not yet." Jaylen didn't sit down. He didn't tell her to leave. Part of him already understood that this wasn't a conversation he could walk away from, that whatever was in that folder had been placed there with the same deliberate care she'd used to shift his furniture and scrub his floors. She moved to the counter and rested one hand on the folder without opening it. "If you don't read what's in that folder before tomorrow morning," she said, "someone else will decide what happens to your son. Subscribe before you miss the warning signs someone already saw." The folder stayed closed. The woman stayed where she was, and Jaylen realized that whatever had been set in motion before he walked through his own door wasn't going to stop just because he wanted it to. She opened the folder without asking permission, spreading the pages across the counter in a sequence that looked rehearsed. Routing logs. Shift records. Reassignment notices printed on letterhead Jaylen recognized from emails he'd stopped reading carefully years ago. Each document had his name typed neatly at the bottom, sometimes as the primary contact, sometimes buried in a list of supervisors who'd cycled through the same positions so quickly their faces blurred together in his memory. The first page showed a freight yard outside York County, Pennsylvania. Jalen had worked there for 11 weeks during what management called a temporary reassignment, covering for a supervisor who'd been out on medical leave that somehow never ended. He remembered the drive, 3 hours each way before dawn, and how Malik had stopped asking when he'd be home for dinner. The second page listed a facility in Hagerstown, Maryland, another short-term placement that had stretched into 4 months. Then, Upper Marlboro. Then a warehouse in Allen Parish, Louisiana, that required a motel room Jalen paid for himself because the reimbursement paperwork kept getting lost. "You recognize these," the woman said, and it wasn't a question. Jalen did. He recognized all of them. Each location represented weeks or months where his schedule had bent around emergencies that were always urgent but never explained. Staffing gaps, he'd been told. Operational needs. Chances to demonstrate leadership in challenging environments. Phrases his manager had used while handing him assignments that came with longer commutes but never different titles or raises. The woman slid another document forward, this one dense with timestamps and load manifests. 3 different facilities had workers reach out to OSHA in the last 8 months, she said. Each time, the complaints were filed, logged, and sent somewhere that wasn't Tri-County's legal department. She tapped one of the dates with a fingernail that had been bitten down to the quick. "You were assigned to York County 2 weeks after the first complaint, Upper Marlboro 3 weeks after the second." Jalen stared at the timeline, watching the pattern emerge like something that had been there all along, waiting for someone to point it out. The reassignments hadn't felt random at the time, but they hadn't felt strategic either. They'd felt like the grinding, exhausting reality of a job that demanded everything and acknowledged nothing. The kind of work that left him smelling like diesel and metal even after he showered. The scent settling so deep into his skin that Malik had started asking about it. "You thought you were filling gaps," the woman said, her voice quieter now but no less precise. "You thought exhaustion meant survival." Jalen wanted to argue, but the documents were arranged in front of him like evidence in a courtroom, each one building on the last. Locations where equipment violations had been flagged. Facilities where injury rates had climbed just high enough to trigger internal reviews that somehow never produced findings. Shifts where supervisors had rotated through so quickly that no one stayed long enough to notice the pattern or care enough to ask why. The woman pulled one more page from the folder, a personnel transfer log that showed his name moving across state lines with the kind of frequency that should have raised questions but apparently hadn't. High-risk loads were funneled through understaffed shifts, she said. When delays happened, or when injuries piled up, accountability followed whoever was officially present. Reassignment paperwork scattered the responsibility just enough to keep it from ever climbing upward. Jalen felt something cold settle in his chest, the kind of understanding that arrives too late to matter and too completely to ignore. He'd thought he was being noticed. He'd thought stepping up meant eventual recognition, that the extra hours and impossible assignments were building towards something better than another temporary placement with no end date. The woman looked at him directly, and for the first time since he'd found her in his apartment, her expression shifted into something that might have been regret. "You weren't filling gaps, Jalen," she said. "You were absorbing failure." Jalen finally sat down, not because he wanted to, but because his legs had stopped holding him the way they should. The chair scraped against the linoleum, a sound that felt too loud for the moment, and the woman remained standing, watching him process what she'd just said with the patience of someone who'd already watched others go through the same realization. "You weren't overworked," she said, and the way she paused made it clear she wanted him to hear what came next with absolute clarity. "You were positioned." The word landed differently than the ones before it. Positioned implied intention. It implied design. It meant someone had looked at a map of facilities and schedules and risk assessments and decided that Jalen Cross, single father with a mortgage and a son who needed health insurance, was exactly the right person to put in exactly the right place when things went exactly wrong. She pulled out another document, this one different from the routing logs and transfer notices. It was an internal risk assessment from a facility in Brazoria County, Texas, dated 14 months earlier. The report flagged equipment violations serious enough to warrant immediate shutdowns, listed them in careful bureaucratic language that made catastrophic failure sound like a scheduling inconvenience. At the bottom, in a section labeled Recommended Actions, someone had typed a single line, "Defer pending operational transition." "They knew," the woman said. "Months before you ever set foot in half these locations. They knew the equipment was failing. The safety protocols weren't being followed. and the injury rates were climbing past anything that could be explained away as normal workplace accidents. Jalen stared at the assessment, at the dates that preceded his arrival by weeks or months, at the careful documentation of problems that had apparently been serious enough to record but not serious enough to fix. Then why send anyone there at all? He asked. Because work still had to get done, she said. Freight still had to move, deadlines still had to be met. And if something went wrong, if an injury occurred or a shipment got delayed or an OSHA inspector showed up asking questions, there needed to be someone on site whose name could go in the incident report. The logic was clean in a way that made Jalen's stomach turn. Not evil, exactly, but efficient, in the same way a machine was efficient, processing inputs and producing outputs, without concerning itself with what got ground up in between. He thought about the nights he'd come home too exhausted to help Malik with homework, the weekends he'd missed because mandatory overtime had stopped feeling optional, the promotions that had always seemed just one more assignment away but never quite materialized. You thought they were testing you, the woman said, and it wasn't a question because she'd clearly seen this pattern before. Understood how it worked from the inside in a way that made Jalen wonder exactly how much she'd known and when she'd known it. You thought if you just worked hard enough, proved yourself reliable enough, eventually someone would notice and reward that effort. Jalen had thought exactly that. He'd thought exhaustion was the price of ambition, that the diesel smell embedded in his clothes, and the metal scent Malik kept asking about were proof he was willing to do what others wouldn't. He'd thought survival meant something. The woman slid the risk assessment back into the folder and pulled out one more document, this one a personnel evaluation from 18 months earlier. Jalen's name sat at the top, followed by ratings that were uniformly positive, descriptions of his work ethic that used words like dependable and adaptable and committed. At the bottom, in a section asking whether the employee should be considered for advancement, someone had checked a box labeled, "Not at this time." The evaluation was dated 3 weeks before his first reassignment to York County. "You were never going to be promoted," the woman said, her voice quieter now but no less devastating. "You were selected because you wouldn't ask the right questions, because you needed the job too much to risk losing it, and because if something went catastrophically wrong, your name would be the one in the official record, while everyone above you stayed insulated." Jalen felt the room tilt, not dramatically but enough that he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. 6 years. 6 years of believing that hard work mattered, that showing up and doing the job and never complaining would eventually mean something beyond the next impossible assignment in the next failing facility. 6 years of thinking he was building something when he'd actually been absorbing the structural failures of a system designed to protect everyone except the people doing the actual work. And now he had an employment record that would read like complicity to anyone who didn't know the full story, a paper trail linking his name to safety violations and incident reports across 3 states, documentation that made him look like a willing participant in decisions he'd never been consulted on. If this became public, if investigators started asking questions about what he knew and when he knew it, the truth wouldn't matter as much as the pattern the documents created. The woman closed the folder, and for the first time since Jalen had found her scrubbing his floor, she looked uncertain, like she'd reached the part of this conversation she hadn't fully rehearsed. "I need to tell you who I am," she said, "because once you know, you'll understand why I'm here and why it matters that I came alone." Her name was Rowan Bellamy, and she ran Tri-County Freight Systems. The name Jalen had only ever seen at the bottom of policy emails he never finished reading was now sitting across from him in his kitchen, industrial cleaner drying on her cuffs, explaining why she'd broken into his apartment instead of sending a lawyer or scheduling a meeting at corporate headquarters in Baltimore. "You shouldn't be here," Jalen said, and this time he meant something different than when he'd first found her scrubbing his floor. "I know," Rowan said. "That's why I didn't bring anyone with me." The logic should have been reassuring. Instead, it made everything worse, because it meant she understood exactly how inappropriate this was, how many professional boundaries she was crossing, how much risk she was taking by sitting in the home of an employee whose name appeared in documents that were apparently about to become very important to people with subpoena power. She'd chosen to come anyway, and that choice carried implications Jalen wasn't ready to process. He looked at her hands, still marked with faint chemical burns from whatever she'd been cleaning before he arrived, and tried to reconcile the image with the signature he'd seen on corporate communications about efficiency initiatives and safety priorities. Rowan Bellamy had spent 6 years reading his name at the bottom of policy emails he never finished. Now she was sitting in his kitchen, and the only email she'd sent him was the one she'd hand-delivered in a folder he still hadn't opened completely. "Why come yourself?" Jalen asked. "Why not send someone from legal, Someone from HR, anyone who isn't personally liable for whatever system you're describing. Rowan's expression shifted, not dramatically but enough that Jalen recognized the look from his own mirror on mornings when Malik asked questions he didn't know how to answer. Because if I sent someone else, she said, they'd document it. There would be a record of contact. A paper trail showing the company reached out to you before certain things became public, and that record could be used to suggest we were trying to intimidate you or influence your testimony. My testimony, Jalen repeated, the word feeling foreign in his mouth. Yes, Rowan said. She didn't apologize for the assumption, didn't soften it with qualifiers or legal disclaimers. Just acknowledged that she was sitting in his apartment because she needed something from him and was willing to risk her own position to get it without creating documentation that could make things worse. The power imbalance should have tilted entirely in her direction. She ran a company that employed 3,000 people across 8 states. She made decisions about budgets and expansion strategies, and which facilities stayed open when quarterly numbers dropped. Jalen supervised loading dock shifts and filled out incident reports, and tried to explain to Malik why he couldn't make it to parent-teacher conferences because someone in Pennsylvania or Louisiana or Maryland needed coverage. That couldn't wait. But Rowan was the one sitting in his kitchen uninvited, the one who'd lied to his landlord and scrubbed his floors, and brought documents she wasn't supposed to share with anyone outside the investigation she'd mentioned but not explained. She had institutional power, but she'd chosen to exercise it in a way that made her personally vulnerable. And Jalen didn't know what that meant except that whatever was in the folder was serious enough to warrant breaking rules she'd probably spent her entire career learning to follow. The sound of footsteps on the stairs outside broke the silence between them. Jalen glanced at the clock above the stove. 6:45. Malik wasn't supposed to be back from his aunt's place in Fairfax County until after 7, but the key was already turning in the lock, and Rowan's expression shifted into something Jalen couldn't quite read as the door swung open. Malik stopped short when he saw her at the table, backpack sliding down one shoulder, his face pale in the way it got when he stayed up too late, reading under the covers. He looked at Jalen, then at Rowan, then back at Jalen with the kind of careful assessment that meant he was trying to figure out what kind of trouble he'd walked into. Is she from work? Malik asked. Rowan answered before Jalen could decide how to frame it. Yes, she said, her voice carrying none of the careful corporate tone she'd used when explaining routing logs and risk assessments. Just a simple acknowledgement that stripped away any pretense about why she was sitting at their kitchen table. Malik studied her face with the kind of directness only children seemed capable of, the sort of unfiltered assessment that adults learned to hide behind politeness and professional distance. He dropped his backpack near the door, let it thud against the baseboard in the spot where Rowan had been scrubbing when Jalen first arrived, and moved to the refrigerator without breaking eye contact with her. Then why does my dad always smell like metal when he comes home? Malik asked. The question landed in the silence between them with the weight of something simple and devastating, the kind of observation that shouldn't have mattered but somehow stripped away every layer of corporate language and strategic positioning Rowan had constructed over the past hour. Not an accusation. Not a complaint. Just curiosity about a detail Malik had noticed the way children notice everything their parents try to hide. Jalen opened his mouth to deflect, to say something about machinery, or industrial equipment, or the realities of warehouse work, but Rowan spoke first, and the way her expression changed made it clear she understood exactly what Malik had just done without meaning to. Because the places I sent him weren't safe, Rowan said. Malik pulled a container of leftover pasta from the refrigerator, examined it to see if it was still good, and set it on the counter with the casual efficiency of someone who'd learned to feed himself when his father worked late. But you run the company, he said, still not accusatory. Still just trying to understand the logic of a world where the person in charge sent people to places that made them smell like metal and come home too tired to help with homework. I do, Rowan said. So you could make them safe. Yes. Some questions don't need answers to devastate. They just need to be asked by someone too young to know they shouldn't ask them. Malik nodded, processing this information the way he processed most things, with a seriousness that made him seem older than 11 and more tired than any child should be. He didn't push further, didn't demand explanations or apologies. He just took his pasta to his room, pausing at the hallway entrance long enough to look back at Jalen with an expression that asked a question he didn't say out loud. Is everything going to be okay? Jalen didn't know how to answer, so he just nodded, and Malik disappeared down the hall, his door clicking shut with the kind of careful quiet that suggested he understood more about the conversation than he'd let on. The apartment felt different after Malik left. smaller and more exposed, like his presence had been the only thing keeping certain truths at a manageable distance. Rowan sat very still at the table, hands folded in front of her, in a way that looked more like someone trying to hold themselves together than someone maintaining professional composure. "He shouldn't have to think about why you smell like metal," she said quietly, not looking at Jalen, her gaze fixed somewhere past the window where the evening light was fading into the kind of dusk that made everything look temporary. "He should be worried about homework and whether his friends like him and what he wants to be when he grows up, not whether his father is safe at work." Jalen wanted to argue, to say that Malik was fine, that kids were resilient, that this was just the reality of single parenthood and demanding jobs and doing whatever it took to keep the lights on and food in the refrigerator. But the metal smell was still on his hands from this morning's shift, faint but present, and he couldn't remember the last time Malik had stopped asking about it. The silence stretched between them, until Rowan finally looked up, and whatever she saw in Jalen's expression seemed to make her decide something she'd been holding back since she first sat down at his table. "There's more I haven't told you," she said, "and you need to hear it before you decide what to do next." After Malik's door clicked shut, Rowan sat motionless at the table for longer than conversation usually allowed, and Jalen found himself doing something he hadn't planned. He filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet, the kind of automatic hospitality his mother had drilled into him years before Malik was born. The water heated slowly, the only sound in the apartment besides the muffled hum of traffic outside and the occasional creak of Malik moving around in his room. Rowan watched him prepare the tea without commenting, and when he set a mug in front of her, she wrapped both hands around it like the warmth mattered more than the drink itself. They sat in silence for a moment that felt almost normal, almost civil, like 2 people who'd reached the difficult part of a conversation and needed a brief pause before continuing. She took a sip, set the mug down carefully, and looked at him with an expression that suggested whatever came next would be worse than anything she'd already said. "Thank you," she said quietly. And Jalen realized it was the first time she'd acknowledged the strangeness of sitting in his kitchen uninvited, the first crack in the careful composure she'd maintained since he'd found her scrubbing his floor. "For hearing me out." Jalen almost believed the moment meant something. Almost thought maybe this conversation would end with an understanding, an apology, some acknowledgement that the system she'd described could be fixed before it consumed anyone else. Then Rowan reached into her bag and pulled out something that hadn't been in the folder earlier, and the brief illusion of civility evaporated like steam from the tea neither of them was drinking anymore. The envelope was sealed, official, marked with federal letterhead that Jalen recognized from tax documents, and the kind of mail that arrived certified and required signatures. Rowan set it on the table between them, and the way she positioned it, carefully aligned with the edge of the placemat Malik had made in 3rd grade, suggested she'd been carrying it the entire time but hadn't known when to produce it. "This isn't addressed to me," she said. Jalen looked at the envelope and saw his own name typed across the front in the impersonal font government agencies used when they wanted to remove any trace of humanity from correspondence. Not Rowan Bellamy, not Tri-County Freight Systems. Jalen Cross, with his apartment address spelled out in full, including the unit number his landlord sometimes forgot when sorting mail. He opened it slowly, the paper thick and official under his fingers, and pulled out documents that recontextualized everything Rowan had said in the past hour. A subpoena request tied to a multi-state investigation already underway. Depositions scheduled across Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Texas. Facilities listed by name and address. Workers identified by employee numbers that Jalen recognized from routing logs he'd signed without understanding their significance. His name appeared 17 times across 4 pages, circled in ink that definitely wasn't Rowan's handwriting, highlighted in sections that detailed reassignment patterns and shift coverage during periods when specific safety violations had been documented. The investigation wasn't theoretical, it wasn't pending. It was active, comprehensive, and far enough along that someone had already compiled evidence linking Jalen's movements to incidents he'd never been told were being investigated. The second major twist arrived, not with drama but with the quiet devastation of watching something reframe itself in real time. Rowan hadn't come because she'd discovered the truth. She'd come because the truth had already been discovered by people with authority she couldn't control, and it was about to surface in ways that would destroy everything she'd spent years building, including the carefully constructed narrative that she hadn't known about the system she'd just described to him in meticulous detail. Sometimes the most important revelations don't announce themselves. They just sit there in federal letterhead, waiting to be read. "This has been active for 8 months, Jalen said, reading the case number and filing dates that predated this conversation by the better part of a year. "Yes," Rowan said. "You didn't come here to warn me. You came because you're already caught." She didn't deny it. She just sat there with her hands still wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone lukewarm, looking at him with an expression that might have been shame or might have been calculation. Jalen couldn't tell anymore, couldn't trust his ability to read someone who'd been lying by omission since the moment he'd walked through his own door. "I didn't bring this to scare you," Rowan said, her voice steadier than it had any right to be given what she'd just revealed. "I brought it because when this becomes public, people will say you were part of the problem. They'll say you knew about the violations, that you participated in covering them up, that you benefited from a system designed to protect management at the expense of workers who had no idea they were being positioned to absorb liability." Jalen felt the room tilt slightly, the same sensation he'd experienced when she first explained how reassignments worked, except this time the foundation shifting beneath him wasn't metaphorical. The investigation was real, the subpoena was real. The narrative being constructed about his role in a system he'd only just learned existed was already taking shape in documents he had no power to contest. "What do you need from me?" he asked, because the answer was obvious now, had been obvious since she'd broken into his apartment and started scrubbing stains that didn't matter to anyone except as evidence that she'd been here, that she'd tried to do something before the truth arrived in official envelopes with federal letterheads. Rowan met his eyes directly for the first time since pulling out the envelope. "I need you on record before this becomes public," she said. "I need your testimony documenting when you learned about the reassignment strategy, what you were told, what you weren't told. I need you to establish that this wasn't conspiracy, it was exploitation." "You need me," Jalen repeated. "Yes," Rowan said, and something in her expression shifted, became more human and more desperate than anything she'd shown him before, "and I won't pretend otherwise." Jalen sat with the subpoena in his hands for longer than Rowan seemed comfortable with, reading through the sections that detailed what federal investigators already knew and what they were still trying to establish. The language was careful, technical, designed to avoid accusations while making it clear that someone was going to be held accountable for a system that had apparently been grinding through workers across 3 states for the better part of a decade. His name kept appearing in contexts he didn't recognize, shift coverage during periods when specific incidents had occurred, reassignments that aligned with complaint filings he'd never been told about. The investigation had assembled a timeline that made him look complicit in decisions he'd never been consulted on, positioned him as a knowing participant in a strategy he'd only learned about 2 hours ago when a stranger started scrubbing his kitchen floor. "What happens if I don't testify?" Jalen asked, though he already knew the answer from the way Rowan's expression tightened. "The investigation proceeds without your perspective," she said. "They build their case using the documents they've already collected, the patterns they've already identified. Your silence becomes part of the evidence, proof that you're protecting the company instead of clarifying your role. And if I do testify? You lose your job. Maybe not immediately, maybe not officially, but eventually something will happen that makes it impossible for you to stay. A restructuring, a facility closure, a position elimination that just happens to affect the people who spoke to federal investigators about company practices." The honesty was almost worse than a comfortable lie would have been. Rowan wasn't pretending she could protect him, wasn't offering assurances that telling the truth would lead to vindication or justice or any of the outcomes that made cooperating with investigations seem worthwhile. She was just laying out the reality of what happened to people who went on record against systems that had layers of protection built into their design. Jalen thought about Malik sleeping down the hall, about the health insurance that covered his asthma medication and the quarterly checkups that kept him stable. He thought about the mortgage payment that was due in 12 days, and the car that needed new brakes, and the electricity bill that seemed to climb every month no matter how careful they were about turning off lights. He thought about 6 years of reassignments and metal smells and coming home too exhausted to be the father Malik deserved, all in service of a job that had apparently been using him as insulation for failures he'd never been positioned to prevent. The choice shouldn't have been this difficult. But difficult choices had stopped being hypothetical the moment a CEO started scrubbing his kitchen floor. Testifying meant telling the truth, establishing the record, making it clear he'd been exploited rather than complicit, but it also meant losing the stability that kept Malik fed and housed and medically covered, trading one kind of uncertainty for another kind that came with no guarantees, except that speaking up would make him a problem someone needed to solve. "I can't protect Malik if I don't have a job," Jalen said quietly. "You can't protect him if your name is tied to a federal investigation that labels you as a willing participant in systematic safety violations, Rowan replied. The document trail they've built makes you look like you knew. If you stay silent, that narrative stands unchallenged. Subscribe before silence becomes the evidence against you. Jalen realized with the kind of clarity that felt like something breaking that there was no version of this where he walked away clean. Speaking up meant risking everything he'd built over 6 years of impossible assignments. Staying silent meant accepting a narrative that would follow him into any future employment, any background check, any attempt to move forward with a career that wouldn't make Malik ask why he smelled like metal when he came home. I'm not doing this to help you, Jalen said, looking at Rowan directly. I'm doing this because staying quiet will destroy me anyway. Just slower, and with less control over how it happens. I understand, Rowan said. Do you? Jalen asked, and the question carried weight that had nothing to do with corporate liability or federal investigations, and everything to do with the fact that Rowan would land somewhere soft when this was over, would have severance packages and professional networks and options that didn't include wondering how to explain employment gaps to hiring managers who'd already Googled his name and found the wrong answers. Rowan didn't argue. She just nodded, and the silence that followed felt like an acknowledgement of something they both understood, but couldn't change. When are the hearings scheduled? Jalen asked. Rowan pulled out her phone, scrolled through a calendar that apparently existed outside the official company systems, and showed him dates that started in 2 weeks and stretched across the next 3 months. Baltimore, Harrisburg. A federal building in Houston whose address meant nothing to Jalen but apparently meant something to investigators who'd been assembling evidence since before he knew evidence was being collected. Nothing can stop this now, she said. And it wasn't a warning or a threat. Just a statement of fact, delivered in the same tone she'd used when explaining how reassignment paperwork had scattered accountability across state lines. The machine was already in motion, grinding toward a conclusion that would reshape careers and reputations regardless of who wanted it to stop. The deposition room in the federal building on North Howard Street in Baltimore was smaller than Jalen had expected, windowless and painted the kind of institutional beige that made time feel suspended. 2 investigators sat across from him, a court reporter positioned to his left, recording equipment running in a way that made every word feel permanent. Rowan had testified the day before in a different room on a different floor, and Jalen hadn't been allowed to know what she'd said or how long she'd been questioned. The investigator closest to him was a woman named Chen who'd introduced herself without offering a handshake, just a polite nod and an explanation that this was an informal deposition, that Jalen wasn't under oath, but that lying to federal investigators carried the same legal consequences as perjury. She'd spent the first 20 minutes walking him through his employment history, establishing dates and locations that matched the documents Rowan had spread across his kitchen table 3 weeks earlier. Then she asked the question Jalen had been dreading since he'd agreed to testify. When did you first suspect that your reassignments were part of a systematic strategy to distribute liability rather than address staffing shortages? The room went very quiet. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her stenotype machine, waiting. Chen's expression remained neutral, professional, giving nothing away about what answer she expected or what consequences would follow depending on how he responded. Jalen could tell the truth. He could say he'd first learned about the strategy 2 hours before agreeing to testify, that a woman had broken into his apartment and explained a system he'd never suspected existed. That answer would establish his innocence, prove he'd been exploited rather than complicit, and make it clear the reassignments had been designed to position him without his knowledge or consent. It would also prove that Rowan had known, that she'd understood the system well enough to explain it in detail, that she'd sat in his kitchen and walked him through routing logs and risk assessments and OSHA complaints with the kind of precision that only came from direct involvement. If Jalen admitted he'd learned everything from her in a single conversation, it would destroy whatever defense she was trying to construct about gradual awareness or institutional complexity that prevented clear oversight. The alternative was lying. Saying he'd suspected something was wrong months earlier, that he'd noticed the patterns himself and had been quietly documenting concerns before the investigation began. That would make him look complicit, like someone who'd seen problems and stayed silent, but it would also protect Rowan from questions about when she'd known and why she'd waited so long to act. Chen waited patiently, and Jalen realized that this moment was exactly what the investigation was designed to create. A choice between self-preservation and institutional loyalty, between truth that would shield him and lies that would shield the people who'd positioned him to absorb their failures. I didn't suspect anything, Jalen said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. I was told about the reassignment strategy on October 14th of this year, by someone who explained how it worked and why I'd been selected for specific placements. "Who told you?" Chen asked. "Rowan Bellamy." The court reporter's fingers moved across the keys, recording words that couldn't be taken back. Chen made a note on her legal pad, her expression unchanged, and moved to the next question without acknowledging what Jalen had just done or what it would mean for Rowan's testimony from the day before. The deposition lasted another 90 minutes, walking through facilities and incidents and conversations Jalen barely remembered. By the time Chen thanked him for his cooperation and explained that he might be called for additional questioning, Jalen felt hollowed out, like something essential had been extracted and cataloged for purposes he wasn't allowed to understand. He left the federal building and stood on North Howard Street, watching afternoon traffic blur past while he tried to process what he'd just set in motion. The metal smell was still on his hands from that morning's shift, faint but persistent, and he wondered how long it would take before everything he'd just testified about became public knowledge, before the careful narrative he'd helped construct became evidence in a case that would reshape careers and reputations in ways he couldn't predict or control. 3 weeks passed in a kind of suspended tension, each day blurring into the next, as Jalen waited for something to happen that would tell him whether his testimony had mattered or just positioned him differently in a system that would continue grinding forward, regardless of who spoke up or stayed silent. He went to work. He came home. He helped Malik with homework and made dinner, and tried not to think about federal investigators assembling timelines in windowless offices across Maryland and Pennsylvania and Texas. Then, on a Tuesday morning when frost covered the windows and Malik's school had delayed opening 2 hours because of ice, Rowan showed up at Jalen's apartment again, and this time, she didn't bring cleaning supplies. Rowan stood in the doorway without the carefully constructed composure she'd carried the first time she'd appeared uninvited. Her suit was wrinkled in a way that suggested she'd slept in it, or hadn't slept at all, and the shadows under her eyes made her look older than she had 3 weeks earlier when she'd been scrubbing grape juice stains from Jalen's baseboard. She didn't apologize for showing up unannounced. She just waited for Jalen to step aside and let her in, which he did because some part of him had been expecting this ever since he'd watched the court reporter's fingers move across the stenotype machine, recording his testimony about when he'd learned the truth and who had told him. "The board is voting this afternoon," Rowan said, settling into the same chair she'd occupied before, the one facing the window where morning light cut across the kitchen in angles that made everything look temporary. 2 o'clock. They've been in closed session since yesterday, reviewing the investigation findings and deciding how to respond before the report becomes public. Jalen poured coffee he'd made for Malik's breakfast and set a mug in front of her without asking if she wanted it. She wrapped her hands around it the same way she had with the tea, like the warmth was the only solid thing in a situation that had stopped making sense somewhere between his deposition and her second round of testimony in Harrisburg. "What happens if they vote to remove you?" Jalen asked. Rowan stared into the coffee, watching steam rise and dissipate against the ceiling. "The company survives," she said. "They issue a statement about holding leadership accountable. They promise reforms and oversight improvements, and they position my removal as evidence that the system is correcting itself. The investigation findings get absorbed into a narrative about one executive who failed to maintain proper controls, and Tri-County Freight continues operating with minimal disruption. And if they don't remove you, then it becomes institutional. The board's decision to keep me means they either didn't know about the reassignment strategy, which makes them negligent, or they did know and chose not to act, which makes them complicit. Either way, the company can't survive the liability. Facilities shut down, contracts get canceled, 3,000 people lose jobs because the system that was supposed to protect the company ends up destroying it instead." The logic was clean and devastating, the kind of corporate calculus that reduced human consequences to risk assessments and strategic positioning. Rowan would be sacrificed to save an institution that had exploited workers across 3 states for nearly a decade, or she'd survive and watch that institution collapse under the weight of accountability it was never designed to carry. "You're here because you want me to tell you it's okay," Jalen said. "That being fired is the right outcome, that you deserve whatever the board decides." "No," Rowan said quietly. "I'm here because in about 5 hours, someone is going to knock on your door and ask for a comment about the CEO who broke into your apartment to manipulate your testimony. And I wanted you to hear from me first, that whatever I did or didn't do, whatever I knew or should have known, I never meant for Malik to smell like metal when you came home." The apology landed in the space between them, with all the weight of something that should have been said weeks earlier, before depositions and subpoenas and federal investigations that had stopped being theoretical and become the grinding machinery of consequence. Jalen didn't know if he believed her, didn't know if intention mattered when the outcome had been 6 years of reassignments that had positioned him to absorb failures he'd never been equipped to prevent. Rowan's phone vibrated on the table between them, a single sharp buzz that made them both look down at the screen. Then it vibrated again, a third time. Messages arriving in rapid succession, the kind of pattern that meant something significant was happening, and people needed her to respond immediately. Then the vibrating stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the notification sounds had, like the absence of information carried more weight than whatever the messages might have contained. Rowan stared at the phone without reaching for it, and Jalen realized she was afraid to look, afraid to confirm that the decision had already been made, and her presence in his apartment was just another attempt to control something that had stopped being controllable the moment federal investigators had started assembling timelines. "Aren't you going to check?" Jalen asked. Rowan shook her head slowly. "Not yet," she said. "Whatever it says, it won't change what happens next." Outside, a car slowed in front of the building, its engine idling in a way that suggested the driver was checking an address or waiting for confirmation about which unit to approach. Jalen moved to the window and saw a dark sedan with government plates, the kind federal investigators drove when they needed to look official without being obviously marked. Someone knocked on the door, 3 measured raps that echoed through the apartment, with the finality of something that had been inevitable since the moment Rowan had first explained how reassignment paperwork scattered accountability across state lines. And this time, Rowan didn't move to answer it. The knock came again, 3 sharp raps that suggested whoever was outside had confirmed the address and wasn't leaving without answers. Jalen stood between the window and the table, watching Rowan sit motionless in the chair where she'd first explained how systems worked, where she'd pulled out a subpoena with his name circled 17 times, where she'd admitted needing him on record before truth became public. The car idled outside, exhaust visible in the morning cold. A second person sat in the passenger seat, head down over what looked like case files. Federal investigators didn't arrive alone for casual conversations. Rowan picked up her phone, unlocked it with unsteady hands, and read the messages that had arrived during the board's closed session. Her expression settled into something that looked like exhausted clarity. "They voted," she said quietly, setting the phone face down. 30 minutes ago. She didn't explain whether she'd been fired or retained, whether the company would survive or collapse. She just stared at the phone like it contained questions she hadn't figured out how to ask. The knock came a third time, and a voice called through the door, professional and patient. "Mr. Cross? This is Special Agent Reeves, with the Department of Labor. We need to speak with you about your testimony from last week. Not about the board vote, not about Rowan's presence in his apartment, about his testimony, about the moment he'd chosen truth and told investigators exactly when he'd learned about the reassignment strategy and who had explained it with the kind of precision that only came from direct involvement." Jalen looked down at his hands, still marked with metallic residue from this morning's shift. The smell was there, subtle but persistent, embedded in his palms where industrial work left traces soap never quite removed. The same smell Malik had asked about. The question that had stripped through every layer of corporate explanation to expose the simple reality that a child shouldn't wonder why his father came home smelling like machinery and failure. He realized that no matter what was on the other side of that door, no matter what Agent Reeves wanted or what the board had decided, Malik would keep smelling metal on his hands unless something fundamental changed. Unless the system that had positioned him to absorb failure was dismantled completely, not just reformed but rebuilt with accountability that flowed upward instead of scattering across reassignment paperwork and temporary placements in facilities that had been failing before he'd arrived. "I should answer it," Jalen said. Rowan stood slowly, straightening her wrinkled suit in a gesture that looked like muscle memory. "I know," she said. She moved toward the door, then stopped, hand hovering over the knob. For a moment Jalen thought she might actually open it, might face whatever consequences waited with the same composure she'd brought 3 weeks earlier when she'd been scrubbing grape juice stains and explaining systems designed to protect everyone except the people doing the actual work. But she didn't turn the knob. She just stood there, hands suspended, while the knock came again, and Agent Reeves's voice filtered through with questions about testimony and timelines and discrepancies that had emerged during the investigation's final review. The phone buzzed once more, a single vibration suggesting someone else needed Rowan's response. The car didn't pull away. Morning light shifted across the kitchen floor, marking time that felt both suspended and accelerating toward conclusions that would arrive whether they were ready or not. Whatever happened next, whatever truth was about to surface through that door and reshape every narrative about responsibility and knowledge and institutional protection, it would not stay contained to windowless deposition rooms or closed board sessions or kitchens where CEOs had tried scrubbing away evidence that couldn't be cleaned from memory or federal timelines. Jalen reached past Rowan toward the door. The knock came again, and neither of them moved to answer it.